Welcome to Paper Cuts and Plot Twists, where the paper is dangerous and the plots are twisted.
Paper cuts, what's the risk? Just another day in the life, just another plot twist. But is it a tragedy, a comedy, romantasy, just another fantasy? It's paper cuts and plot twists. The rest we'll wait and see.
Welcome back to Paper Cuts and Plot Twists. This is episode 6, High Noonish. Today we're going to be talking about Westerns and its impact on storytelling, why we love the Western genre, but not only the Western genre, but what is it about the Western that draws readers in and keeps them coming back to that type. There's a lot of really beautiful things about the Western, and I grew up watching Western movies. My dad was a big fan of them. If they were on TV, we were watching it. If the Duke was in it, then we were watching it. You name it, we watched Westerns. That was my dad's favorite. And I mean, he listened to country music. It's a whole thing. We're going to get into why. And I'm joined actually with my friend, Paul Scott Grill. He'll be sharing a little bit more later. So stay tuned for that, and let's get started.
Paper cuts and plot twists. The rest we'll wait and see.
I'm doing something different today. I'm going unscripted. A lot of times when I do the podcast, I add in a few details, write them down, take my notes. But today I'm going to go unscripted, a little wild, like the Wild West. Because we're talking about Westerns, there's something maybe you've noticed in all of our podcasts. The real theme to Paper Cuts and Plot Twists is storytelling. And every genre, every type of story that we love, that readers love, has elements in it that you can find in any story. And yet, they stand up on their own. So for the Western, we're talking High Noonish, which it does seem that if you have a good Western, whether it's a movie or a book, something's happening at high noon. That's how you know the time. The other day, I think it was 5 something in the morning. It was dark. And when I woke up, I thought it was much later in the day. I looked out at the sky and I'm like, is it going to be cloudy today? In Southern California, it'll get this marine layer, and they call May gray, June gloom, because there's this marine layer that'll hang over the morning and it'll just be cloudy all day. You might not see the sun. Well, for at least a couple hours, maybe until high noon. And then around high noon, you get the sun. And actually, because it was 5:30, the sun actually hadn't risen. But I didn't know that because I thought when I woke up, I just assumed it was later. And I'm like, well, when does the sun rise? And it was 6-ish. You observe it. If you want to tell time in the West, you know where noon is. It's high noon. And I'm guessing it changed with the seasons. So your high noon would change relative to what season it was. But if you're going to have a duel, you're going to have it at high noon. So everybody knows when that is. You may debate on when it's just a little bit past noon or a little bit before noon, but high noon, everybody got that. You knew where the sun was in the sky. It's kind of cool about Westerns too, and the storytelling. There's something about the final frontier. And I think that's where we get the Western. It's this idea that there's this great aspect of land and the prospectors and the adventurers and the travelers and the new immigrants in the land are looking for a place to settle. And they go out into this wild area. A couple months ago actually, it's been a year. We were up in the Northwest and we got to see parts of the Lewis and Clark Trail. And there's this one rock and it looks like a whale. So if you're familiar with the area, you probably know which rock I'm talking about. It's not a rock as much as a hill, a mountain, a little mountain, but it looks like a whale and it jets out into the ocean. And this rock is where the prospect of seeing the Great Sea. And it's said that Sacagawea really wanted to see the ocean, the Great Sea that her people had heard about. She had never seen it. And they weren't going to let her go. And somehow she convinces them to let her see it. I mean, she traveled all this way with them. And that was like the one thing that she wanted to see. And so she gets to see it. She goes to the shore and they look out where this rock is. This is a Western, this wildness, this unknown territory that you're going into, and people and animals, things you've never experienced, much like Lewis and Clark. A lot of the Westerns also have this element of you're going into this settlement and there's other peoples living here and they're going to fight with you because they're defending their land and you guys don't speak the same language. You try to communicate with them, so you're trading with them, these first peoples, native peoples that were there before you, and you're like, I got to figure this out. I don't want them to hurt me, so I need to figure out something fast, which is let's trade with them. Or you go and result to what seems like everybody results to is like, let's just fight them, and they fight you and you fight them, and it just gets bloody and it's tragic. So there's that side of the Western as well, is you're going into foreign lands, even though like this territory belongs to your country, so to say. It doesn't really, and it's not really held by anybody, but there's definitely people like living off the land in those areas. And so you're trying to settle it, but you're like fighting with the people that are already there. And they show up because they winter in the hills and then they summer in the fields. But you didn't know that. You were just like, I'm going to build a house here. And then all of a sudden these people show up and they're like, hey, what are you doing in our field? This is like where we summer. And you're like, I didn't know. And then fights break out. Well, then there's also the side of Westerns, which you see it in the storytelling as lawlessness. Okay, they build a railroad out to the Pacific. And now there's all of these train robbers jumping on because the rich people want the easy way to go to the Pacific, and that's how they can travel. They're not going and doing the wagon trail that everybody before them. So they jump on a train because they have money, so they can. Now you get the train robbers and they're coming in because that's their territory, which is wild. There's the law from the East isn't getting out to the West. So they're kind of creating their own laws and breaking their own laws and fighting with each other. When? At high noon, because that's when you know the time. Everybody can agree that if we're going to like duel, it's going to be high noon. So that happens. So you get this lawlessness. And then you get these towns trying to establish law. Then you also have prospectors. You have people that are going out and they're trying to find gold, or they're trying to find whatever minerals because they can sell it back east. In the East, you have these established cities. It's been a long time since they've had to establish their cities. So they've been existing for a while now. So you find stuff in the West and then you're bringing it back and selling it. You're bringing back samples of things out in the West. And then with the trains, it can start milling and, things like that. So they start building up these little towns for, I don't know, if there's a river near or if there's a mountain near, then they're going to have like the silver mines and the gold mines and whatever other mines that they need to mine. And then they use that and they bring in money. But this also means that there's probably less women around. So then you get these houses for men and the women are there. There's not very many. And this is where they have their romantic liaisons. Because it was harsh out there. It was harsh to be a woman out on the frontier, learning to live off the land, and her husband's out there traveling and whatever, and she's not sure if he's going to come back. And then, granted, then there's these tribes coming in that some are there, and then you're there, and then they're fighting, so then you don't want to leave all of this stuff. So there's like all these things to consider. The women and the children are in dangerous situations, so there's less of them because it's such a risk. The wagon trails that it took to get out there. So a lot of people fleeing from the East and they take these wagons, and just imagine like caring for the animals and you're tenting on the way. I lived in Colorado for a while, and there's a place called the Fort, and it's just in the foothills of Colorado, and you can go and they make recipes from the old trail recipes of when the settlers were coming into that area. Like you can get rattlesnake and whatever else. I mean, it was all this like exotic foods, and I think they would have like campfire type foods. I mean, it was pricey actually, but you could try different things that would have been meals that maybe the old spectators had. And you would have lunch at high noon probably, or you'd be having campfires, and you'd be very practical in the things that you brought with you. You wouldn't have a lot of possessions with you. Also because of the robbers, the Western gangs of the day. So why am I talking about all this? Well, to read a Western, there's a lot of drama, and a lot of that drama is surrounded on these unknown, dangerous lands. So any number of situations can become dangerous. It could be the landscape against the person. It could be the people that were there before you. They travel in and out of the land, and you're now in their place and they're fighting you. There could be the fact that there's a lot of prospectors out there and they're trying to build these mines, and the mines are dangerous and it's isolating, and the winters. So, okay, in Littleton, Colorado, there is a graveyard of Alfred Packer. The story is something like he was out in the mountains. I've been to the area around where he was, and he was with a party of people, and there was a blizzard. And when the blizzard came up, it was kind of unexpected and they got trapped. Alfred Packer is the only one to have survived. But the duration of time that he was there, it's surprising that he survived because no one else did. And when he got back to the Denver area, he went to court because they believed he might have had the delicacy of his party while trapped in the blizzard in the mountains. And I don't think he was, I don't know if they actually accused him of it, but the belief was, the rumor was that that's exactly what happened, and nobody believed anything different. Anyways, he's buried out in the Littleton Cemetery, and the legend of Alfred Packer and the party that he went with is still around because he was desperate. So, right, there's all these stories swirling like, how could you have survived this? Because people didn't survive these things. It was so dangerous. It's dangerous now in the mountains, and we have all of these vehicles and ways to keep ourselves warm, but it still can be very dangerous and treacherous if you're up in these mountains with avalanches. And there's been people trapped in a blizzard in the middle of, like, it was either June or May. I even remember we were there and there was a blizzard that came up in one of the areas in the mountains, and there were these two young men. They weren't prepared for it because it was around June, and I think one of them didn't have a coat and died of hypothermia because that's how dangerous it gets up in the mountains. It can be scary, and it can change very quickly. So imagine that's today, where we have a lot more information, a lot more capacity to protect ourselves than back in the day of that time in like the 1800s. So it's interesting how Westerns are rife with difficulty. All the things we talked about, mystery and drama, and like the even from the perspective of a fantasy, there's this unknown that's out there, and it's this mystery that you're trying to discover. And yet, what's interesting too about the Western, and I think why it's such a popular storytelling genre, is there's something romantic about it as well. And romantic in the sense that we talked about before, this idea of hope, this idea of this elusive thing that we can't find in our current present day. And we're looking outward for that thing, which is kind of why America really is a romantic idea. America is the West. And I remember in a French class, our professor said that a lot of the French thought that America was still cowboys and Indians and wearing cowboy hats. And they have this, I think it's called a Western village that you can go to somewhere in France about America that depicts this westernized culture of basically what we're talking about, this wild, wild west, cowboy boots and cowboy hats and gunslingers and all of that. And in a way, to them, it's this romantic idea because America is the West in all of those ways. At the time of America's development, you have I want to say, well, Benjamin Franklin was an innovator and very refined, spoke many languages. A lot of the early settlers, they came from different places and they were well versed in a lot of things, a lot of culture. And Benjamin Franklin, I think he was an ambassador at one point. They had this sense of culture, and a lot of times the wealthy in the East Coast would send their children to, let's say, France if you wanted to study painting because there was a French style. And so if you wanted to be cultured, you would be cultured in the language of French, and you would be cultured in its art and in England and politics and things like that. You would study in Europe to be refined. But then what developed that was unusual in the art scene was these beautiful landscapes of the American West, these grand hills. I mean, I think there's a painting of, I think they're, I'm not exactly sure, but like Arizona, New Mexico, and you have the Grand Canyon, and then also the mountains and animals, deer. And it was so compelling in the art world because these types of landscapes, they weren't seen. It was also hard to get really accepted from an artist standpoint because it wasn't a style and it wasn't a topic of painting that had been seen. And so it really showed the difference of the American, I guess, culture, but nature and how different and vast it really was and still is. I talk to people who have a perspective of Europe and traveling in Europe, and I'll talk to them about, like, they'll want to come and visit, and I'll talk to them about, like, well, you can see this and this and this, and these are close. And they're like, well, could I go over here? And I'm like, well, that'll take you, if you drive that, it'll take you 12 to 15 hours to get to that location. And they're like, but it's just this far on the map. Because in Europe, yeah, if you look on that distance on a map, it maybe is a couple hours. But from the United States, it's like if you if you try to pinpoint here to here, it could be a day. So you'd actually have to fly there. And so just the vastness of the United States and trying to travel it is very different than if you're in Europe and you're trying to travel it. So imagine from a Western standpoint that you're not only going from the east to the west, but you're going out into this vast and lonely landscape where nobody is, and you're trying to settle and make your way in the world. And that westward expansion happened over some years, and how brave of the people to go. So, a lot of Western literature has this a very Americanized tone to it, and it's influenced by these romantic ideals of looking out west, looking beyond where we are into a world we could create. Again, picking up on the theme of the fantasy of this world that's beyond, the romantic idea of this place that you turn to, that you love, this idea of heaven. Again, those kind of themes come into it, and it's real. I mean, we write a Western or we read a Western, and it's based off of very real places. I remember the story, the movie 310 to Yuma. And if you're traveling from Southern California to Phoenix, you go through Yuma and you see the town. And and the landscape, in a lot of ways, you get into areas, you look around, and there's no cities. It's just vast. Still, there's so many vast open places in Colorado, Nevada, in Arizona, in New Mexico. There's so many all throughout the United States. There's these vast landscapes that are really untouched, and they're just so beautiful. And we have these national parks that we can kind of go into, and it's mind-boggling how massive they truly are. And that is part of the Western. And, of course, like I said, the lawlessness and it's all these things kind of like tied into each other. But it's also coming from this idea that it's the final frontier. Interesting enough, it isn't the final frontier because then we started to look towards space. Once we saw the end to the Pacific, then we started to look up. We started to look at, like, what is up there? And that became our next frontier. And so interesting how we move from the Western to the space trilogy. And also, when we look at a Western, we think of the past. Now, even though, like, it's of a time where that was the future, that was the unknown, that was the thing you were moving to. And now space is that unknown, that thing we're moving to. That's the future. Westerns are the past. We look backwards at a time where this was untouched, this was undeveloped. And now it is developed. So when we think of Westerns, we think of our history, we think back of the American expansion, the good and the bad, all of it, whatever it means, all of the tensions that existed in trying to create places out of nothing, out of difficult landscapes and contexts and dangerous places for all types of people that you didn't even know were there. And how do you communicate, and just all of those things, and animals that you'd never seen before, that have never been really discovered by the West or discovered by the East. So there's all of that kind of unknowns that's happening. So interesting that when we think of Westerns, now we look backwards. But they were the thing that was happening. That was the future that was going forward. But now we've discovered it. So then you move to space trilogies, which we'll talk about in another one. And we're looking upward and outward because we're always looking up and out. We're always kind of pointing west or to that place, that unknown, that sense of adventure that comes with it, I think is really also the compelling part, to start from nothing, to build something new, dealing with it's rife with tension throughout the genre. And that type of storytelling, like imagining, and I would say like stories we love, imagining that those stories we love are like a Western. It's this undiscovered land in your mind that you're seeing for the very first time, that no one has been there, no one has heard of this story before. I recently read, I have to think of the title. Okay, so I was going to talk about a different book, but I want to talk about this one because I think this points at something about what's in the Western storytelling that's compelling. And it has to do with kind of a genre mixing, because I'm not really talking about Western as a genre, but talking about the romantic idea of it, the unknown aspects of moving west, this kind of Americana of what it was like to have land unexplored by many. None of it was explored because a lot, there were people living throughout the West in different places, but there are areas that were unexplored. And that idea of moving into and settling and creating towns and cities and laws and working within the environment, within, the social constructs, and deciding what would it look like, even down to the wars that you had with other nations, other peoples. And like I said, it's not all good and it's not all bad. It's what it was. And I think that's the other side. We have to just look at what it was, and also why that desire is to read it and look backwards, read it and kind of imagine ourselves like in that place of moving to this unknown, which we don't get the experience of doing that much anymore. And I think Westerns really open that up. So the story I want to talk about, so I just finished Sunrise on the Reaping. And the reason, like, I wasn't originally going to talk about this, I think because I read it, it's on my mind during COVID and the lockdowns. I started watching like the Hunger Games. I read the whole series. I watched the movies ad nauseum. It was just constant. Partly because the lockdowns, everything we were going through from that lens was feeling very familiar. Like the experience of the Hunger Games and how people were reacting, and just what this isolation could mean. Because you think about, in the Hunger Games, there's all these districts that get isolated from each other, and then the capital kind of controls it. It really, really, really felt like that was the world we were living in. Well, Suzanne Collins does a good job of understanding history and empires like the Roman and the Greek empires and the Ottoman Empire. You can see the influence of that work, especially the Roman Empire and how that influenced the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is unique because there is this Western placement of storytelling in it, but it is dystopian and it's futuristic because this happens well past our time period. We've already existed, where our generations have passed on, and the Hunger Games exists many, many years after this, turning into Pan Am. It's not America, but you imagine it's in this land, in this area. And what's interesting is there's elements of this rusticity. I don't know, that's not a word. This very rustic nature to District 12, for instance, that it feels a little bit like the Old West, a little bit wild, a little bit scruffy. But what's interesting is layered on that is you have the sophistication of the capital and that influence, and things are digital and they do have TVs. And so there is technology, but it also feels like there's this wild place because they have this fence and there's these wild lands that they can't even go to. And that desire to break free and to get out is there. So how interesting is a story like that that uses the influence of that desire we see in Westerns for moving west or going out from where we are to settle into new places, to be free of the borders and the boundaries that we have around us to go into this new place. So there is that element in it. And even though it's futuristic, it feels like you're reading something from the past. It feels, because they're not sophisticated, And what I mean by sophisticated isn't that they're not intelligent. It's more the sophistication of saying they don't have all of the privilege. Maybe they have to wash in a wash basin, a tub, and they have a water basin, and you see they're just making do with what they have. And it's very, you kind of are trying to scrape out a life for yourself. You're fighting for a life for yourself because you just don't have a lot that's available to you. So even like your food is very sparse. It's just grain as you can get it. And in the West, that would have been true as well. So I read Sunrise on the Reaping recently. So this is what I was reminded of, is that in the Hunger Games, you have the story of Katniss in the Hunger Games, and you can see the influence that Collins has with the Roman Empire and everything that goes with it, of entertainment to the masses is bloody, it's gory, and they have the gladiators fighting in the arenas. And so the similar concept is carrying out in the Hunger Games. In Sunrise on the Reaping, it felt even more Western to me than the Hunger Games did. It's actually the story of Haymitch in his Hunger Games, why he becomes their tribute. And this is 25 years before Katniss goes to her games. Katniss and Peeta go to their games. And in this version of the story, it feels a lot more Western in a lot of ways, just because of how Haymitch lives his life. The things that he says has kind of this country colloquialism to District 12 that almost sounds like something you'd hear in the prairie. And that's interesting to me. There is a romantic element to that as well. And the Hunger Games aren't as sophisticated as they are when you get to Katniss's era. There's a little bit more, like the capital is still a little bit more sophisticated than District 12, but you see the tension between a country life, which is also this Western idea. Preserving the country life has that kind of nostalgia for the West and a simple life, a life that lives off the land, appreciates the landscape and the value of what's around you in nature rather than big cities and big buildings. It's more, as you expand west, you go out and you're living on the land. And the country does that more than a city life, which is here the capital to District 12. I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it as I was thinking about what is it about Westerns? What is it about this high noon? It's living off the land. It's being tied in with the land. It's also this harshness of the land against the person. So you get the tension in the storytelling. And then there's this romantic side of it, of this romantic side of the desire for freedom. And that desire for freedom is very strong in the American mindset, in this ability to protect your life, to build a life, to create something new out of nothing. And I find it even here in the Hunger Games series, this idea that even though this is set in the future, it feels very much alive and present to these Western ideals. So when we talk about Western ideals and Western storytelling, it's not so much the Western that's high noon. But what does high noon mean? It means somebody that's paying attention to the sun, somebody that agrees that where the sun is, this is where we position ourselves. This is what we're observing. We're observing the very movement of nature. And in the very movement of nature, we can agree this is what we set our clock by. This is what we set our time by. When we move west, we look to the sun, we look to the horizon, we watch the sun. We know when the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and we're moving westward. We're moving towards the sun. It's this freedom of opportunity, option that you have that you didn't have before. I think that's beautiful. It's compelling. I feel there's that desire for that type of storytelling still, which is why things like Hunger Games have elements of it for maybe the younger generation, but all of it. My aunt loves Louis L'Amour. She's read all of the series. It's her favorite writer. And I can see it. She loved raising horses. We lived out in the country. We live off the land. We thought about the land. I grew up that way. I grew up on a lake. I climbed trees. I went swimming. For the first time, only a couple years ago, I swam across the whole length of our bay, which was a big deal for me. But I'm attuned to things in nature more than had I not grown up in the country. Like, I'm more aware of those things as an adult, even though I live more a city life, I suppose. I'm more attuned to country life and what happens around me in nature because of it. And the Westerns definitely would be. You needed to be, because it was your survival was at stake. You had to be aware of what was going to happen in the weather and the weather patterns. And when you're in unfamiliar areas, you really had to be attuned to the different changes and be alert to things. But things were new, so you didn't always know. So it took time in observing those things. And that makes for good storytelling, makes for great tension. I'll end with this, one of my favorite books that I read, it was recommended in high school. It was actually a reading assignment in high school, and I didn't read it for the class. I hated reading books that I was told to read by teachers. I'd read something else. I always did enough to do the homework, and I did well with it. My apologies to my teachers. But it wasn't that I didn't love the book. It's just I was reading something else at the time, and that's what I wanted to read, not the book they told me to read. But we took the book, I think for that summer, I took the book My Antonia home. And what was interesting about this is also very prairie, and again with the westward expansion, it's this idea of trying to carve out a life. I read all of the Little House on the Prairie books. I love them. And that again was kind of a similar type of storytelling. But My Antonia was about an immigrant family that spoke German. I remember weeping at that book, and I was so moved by it. It was so beautiful, so tragic. And I felt like because of that book, I was thankful for that book because I really understood what it would take, the difficulty. I didn't understand it completely, but I understood it better than I had ever imagined before, how difficult it is to start over, to start new in a place that's so unfamiliar, so harsh in a lot of ways. How do you etch out a living for yourself where there's nothing, where it's difficult, where no one's done it before? It feels almost impossible, but there's something so courageous about it, so encouraging about it, that your heart beats a little bit faster thinking maybe I could do it too. This is a little bit about Western and Western storytelling, understanding that there's elements to all of these stories that we love and that we look to. And I do think that the Western is romantic. It's for the one who has courage stamped on their heart and they're ready to try something new. Someone that's looking ahead at a hopeful and possible future, one that hasn't happened yet, one that they imagine, and one that they would strive for, maybe even give everything they have for. And there's something about the American spirit that really fits this. So, America, you are our Western expansion, for good or for bad. You have inspired a whole genre of literature and artwork and inspired the hearts of many to look west at a bright and possible future. I have the privilege of introducing my friend Paul Scott Grill. He is writing his first book, which is a Western fantasy, which is just perfect for this episode. I'm so glad that he's going to be sharing his thoughts with us today. His book is coming out in mid-May 2025. And if you want to kind of stay in touch with, the release of his book and his writing, which he does, often on social media, you can catch him at X as Plane Runner 2. So that's at Plane Runner 2, PLAINRUNNER, the number 2. So check him out there. And with that, take it away.
What do we have here? The story of a lonely man hiding his loneliness behind a cloak of independence. A man as bleak as the land over which he rode, yet beneath the harshness and the necessary violence, a kind man, a just man, a man who had come to terms with the land in which he lived. So begins the foreword to Louis L'Amour's landmark 1953 novel Hondo, a book which would establish him as the definitive voice in the Western genre for the next 4 decades. Here we see an author who knows in his bones the enduring strength of this genre, even as he himself sought to develop and build it later in his career. Here we find the same unflagging spirit of hard men and good women who pushed their way through grit and danger with little to no guarantees in order to tame a land that others might build after them. Here, in the pages of The Frontier, with its expanse stretching to the mighty Pacific Ocean, we find the pursuit of that elusive peace that can only be purchased by blood. Go west, young man, and be ready to die. Like the frontier itself, the halcyon days of the Western genre have long since passed. Go visit any Barnes & Noble, and you'll find the section is barely half a rack, tucked at the end of YA and well separated from broader fiction. Neither has the genre fared any better in the cinema, though the occasional nostalgic filmmaker still gives it a go, and Taylor Sheridan has almost single-handedly sustained it in the new world of streaming with his Yellowstone series. Still, these isolated examples pale in comparison to the run of films and shows which once dominated our screens. The maps are filled in now, John Wayne died in 1979, and Clint Eastwood is almost 95 years old. Yet for those who've thumbed through the yellowed pages of garage sale paperbacks, there remains something quiet and powerful, like the wind chasing down the sunset. Like the frontier, the call of the Western refuses to go away completely. The dream of a wide sky still beckons, and we have to ask ourselves, why? Quite simply, the Western is the American myth. The man driving across the plain is our knight errant, called to face a hostile, howling wilderness, while establishing a place for family to follow, even if, like Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, it is not a place for him. And this is why we often see other cultures fall in love with our grand narrative, for the Old West shares common traits with the great tales of the Old World. Here, in the azure-soaked, dust-painted terrain, Odysseus still lives, venturing forth so he can return home. Here also we see an overlap with high honor cultures, as the plainsman has to live by his own code in a hard world that is rapidly changing around him, not unlike the samurai. The guards of a vanishing kingdom live here. The quest for a true cup of water lives here. The heroic gunslinger wears an almost mystical weapon on his hip. And of course, it is here the horses of our collective imagination run. Great, durable, faithful mounts whose majesty would soon be eclipsed by the railroad and the automobile. Here, we find our hurried and harried lives purposely slowed down and stripped of the things we know in our gut we really don't need. Here we find the youthful glee of vibrant dime store pulps and squeaking spinner racks, forgotten, faded, but still alive. Here we find an unbordered emotional canvas big enough for writers to continue exploring the American identity, including its more regretful aspects, particularly seen as westward expansion drove out the land's native inhabitants. Here we can once again wrestle with the innate tensions between the sexes, as the rough and rugged world makes way for the settled homestead. These stories touch upon law and order, justice and revenge, freedom and brotherhood, but even more they rise up from the deep tend and keep instincts of a time-shrouded creational garden, reset in a backdrop of towering natural monuments, tremendous valleys, and deadly enemies, within and without. And, while rich in romance, these stories are stubbornly masculine in their frame. As our modern world pitches and reels trying to understand what it means to be a man, the Western takes its stand and says, I'm still here. In my own life and writing, it is a genre that I've loved from the beginning, but only lately have come to understand. I was introduced to John Ford movies and Louis L'Amour books by my grandfather, whose influence loomed large during my younger years. Like many young men who grew up in the 90s, I found myself angst-ridden and adrift, feeling as though I had the makings of a fire within me, but nowhere to build it, and no one to build it for. What am I here for? Was the shadow that wouldn't leave off. Yet time and again I found, if not answers, at least fellow writers in the pages and vistas of the Old West. However, lest this turn into purely a boy's story, I need to revisit that forward to Hondo, which I opened with. For following the description of his male protagonist, L'Amour immediately hits us with this. We also have a woman, he writes, a woman with a home, no matter how thin the walls or lonely the prospect. For her, there were no ribbons and lace, no waltzes in the moonlight, no gossip over tea, no shopping in the store, only the sunrises and sunsets, a land of changing colors and the cloud shadows, long nights lying awake and alone when any sound might mean the end for her son and herself. But a woman with a home, a woman with a will to persist, to endure. So, why does the Western still speak? The answer, at least to me, is clear. Because we are still men and women, out here on the plains, and it is not good for either of us to be alone. Indeed, in a world with devils filled, we still need each other on the trail, in our homes, in our hearts. Go west, young man and young lady. Go west and live.
Thank you all for joining us on Paper Cuts and Plot Twists, episode 6. I'm so glad that you were here and were able to listen to our discussion on high noonish westerns and why it's so compelling for the stories that we love. So I hope you join us next time. We will be back in 2 weeks, and